My patron Gary Welsh has asked me a question, and it's taken me a long time to get back to him, so I apologise for the delay. Nonetheless, he said, "Hello Tick, this is the first time I've ever asked a question of a YouTube content creator, so I don't know if this is the best way to ask you a question or ask you to address a particular topic. But nevertheless, here goes. Do you think you would be amenable to doing a video on Eisenhower's curious November 1944 decision to stop US 6th Army Group's drive across the southern portion of the Rhine River? His apparent hatred of the commando of said army group, US Army General Jacob Devers, what was really behind the decision, and the implications of these things on the course of the Allied thrust into Western Germany. I certainly have my opinions on the matter, but I find there is a surprising lack of scholarship on the subject. I believe it is an issue that is ripe for fascinating historical examination. Please drop me a brief reply and let me know what you think on the subject. Thanks, Gary Welsh." I'm that far behind with my Patreon Q&As that I've just decided to go ahead and make a video on it. I'll be using a few different sources, but the book on General Jacob Devers by Adams was very useful, as was Jacob L. Devers by Wheeler, and I would recommend either if you're looking for follow-up information. That said, it's worth starting our story a little earlier, in 1943. Devers had clashed with Eisenhower in 1943 over resources. Devers had been in charge of the European Theatre of Operations in England, while Eisenhower was in charge of the Mediterranean Theatre of Operations. The priority was the Mediterranean at this time, so the Air Force in England was stripped of a lot of its manpower and equipment through the winter of 1942 and 1943. It was only in May 1943, after the Axis defeat in Tunisia, that they started to receive a trickle of desperately needed replacements, and this was roughly when Devers took over. Well, on July 28, 1943, Eisenhower wanted 4 bomber groups from Devers' supposed inactive theatre for his own active theatre, because Eisenhower was about to invade the Italian mainland from Sicily. The Allies were struggling to win the air war in Germany, and Devers argued that the removal of these bomber groups at this time would be devastating to the war effort. The British sided with him, so Eisenhower had to appeal to Marshall, who discussed it with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and ultimately they all supported Devers. Eisenhower was furious, and this was made worse when 3 previously borrowed bomber groups were also recalled back to England by Devers, again with Marshall's permission. Historians have since debated whether this decision was the reason Eisenhower didn't like Devers, but honestly the evidence is not conclusive. What is probably more decisive was that because Eisenhower was in the active theatre and was a far more popular character in England since he wasn't against attacking the soft underbelly of Europe, Eisenhower was put in charge of the European Theatre of Operations by Roosevelt, and he would take over the American forces for Overlord. At this point, Devers assumed he would be staying in England to command a force under Eisenhower. But Eisenhower didn't want commanders who he didn't like or thought were poor under his command, so along with others, he got rid of Devers. Now, it's a bit more complicated than this because Marshall liked Devers, and Marshall viewed this request to move Devers to the Mediterranean as a ploy by Eisenhower to get rid of a rival and guarantee Eisenhower's appointment as the American leader for Overlord. Things went back and forth for a little while until Marshall, who was not happy with this, accepted Eisenhower's request. Devers, who was kept out of the loop, wrote a letter to Eisenhower on the 27th of December 1943 telling him that he was looking forward to working with him. Then the very next day, Devers was coming down the elevator in his London hotel when he saw someone reading the London Times. The headline announced that Devers and Eisenhower were changing jobs. That is how Jake was informed of his new assignment. Devers was not happy with this, especially because it meant he wouldn't take part in Overlord. However, it's worth noting that the other American commanders were also not happy with Devers potentially taking command of the forces in Northwest Europe, saying that he was too impulsive. So this suited everyone except Devers himself. Clearly, Eisenhower was motivated partly by revenge, dating from his encounters with Devers in January and during the summer of 1943. Eisenhower was also happiest when surrounded by his own loyal followers and uncomfortable with someone as outspoken as Devers. Obviously, relations between Devers and Eisenhower soured after this. It's true that they were professional rivals, but it also seemed to be a personal issue too. They just didn't see eye to eye with each other because they had different command styles. Relations remained tense when Devers refused to give up the best officers for the European theatre in early 1944. But Devers made a good impression with the British in the Mediterranean, and so when an invasion of southern France was proposed, British Field Marshal Henry Jumbo Wilson told Marshall, "We will need an army group, and I want Devers to be commander." Eisenhower was surprised by this, and though he told Marshall he was happy with the appointment, it was obvious to everyone at SHAEF headquarters that he was not. Still, there simply weren't enough big ports in Northern Europe to sustain all the Allied divisions they needed to fight the Germans, so the southern French ports would need to be captured. Until Antwerp became available, Marseille would become the largest port in Allied hands. During the Battle of the Bulge, more than half of American supplies would come through there. Even in the final campaign in Germany, a quarter of the artillery ammunition for the American army came in through Marseille. Operation Dragoon started on the 15th of August 1944. With Anzio fresh in their minds, the Americans predicted that Marseille would fall on day 45 after the landings. In reality, the German 19th Army, under Army Group G, had been stripped of their strength after the Normandy invasion, and so was hardly a match for the joint Allied force under Devers. On the first day, just 95 Allied soldiers lost their lives, and casualties then decreased even further in the subsequent days. The Germans didn't stand. They only offered delaying actions, and this meant that the Allies advanced much faster than planned. The French took Marseille on the 28th, 13 days after the initial landings, and 32 days earlier than predicted. In 2 weeks, the Dragoon force took 57,000 German prisoners, while suffering 2,700 American and 4,000 French casualties. It was a victory of overwhelming proportions. At roughly the same time, the northern forces liberated Paris. The front line on the 26th of August was roughly here. The Germans were in full retreat at this point, which was unexpected, because after their defeat in Normandy, Eisenhower thought that the Germans would fight on the Rhine River. But they didn't. They fell back, and he was completely surprised by this. There was a bit of back and forth as to what they should do, with Monty suggesting a narrow front strategy in the north, and Eisenhower wanting a broad front strategy. And for reasons explained in my previous video on this topic, Eisenhower chose a broad front strategy which would see all the Allied armies advancing together into Germany. None of Eisenhower's executives liked the compromise, but their complaints were not so loud at the time as they became in later months and years, when each felt that he had been deprived of victory in consequence of that decision. Patton called it the most momentous error of the war. But with the Germans in full retreat, this wasn't actually a bad plan for the time. The major downside for the broad front strategy was that in order to implement it, all the Allied armies would need fuel and ammunition. So as a consequence of Eisenhower's decision, Allied logistics became massively stretched. The Allies had plenty of supplies, but in the north they were sat at the port of Cherbourg and the one surviving Mulberry Harbour on Gold Beach. The further away their armies were from these ports, the further the road and rail transport system would have to go, and the more these services were stretched. Fewer deliveries would reach the frontline troops the closer they got to Germany. Every vehicle ran at least 20 hours a day. Worse, the road and rail network in France had been bombed from the air and sabotaged by the French resistance, to the point that the rail network was in ruins and the road system wasn't much better off. There weren't enough trucks, and those that they did have were breaking down over the long distances thanks to their constant use, while frontline combat units were stripped of their own trucks in order to use them to bring up supplies. As a result, the army suffered huge shortages, and the men became desperate, even going so far as to hijack supply trains and things like that. So as a result of the logistics crisis, Patton's army ran out of fuel on the 2nd of September. Instead of the required 400,000 gallons of petrol he needed, he got just 32,000. Hodge's First Army also ran out of steam a few days later, and it looked like the broad front strategy was beginning to fail. Just as complete victory appeared within easy reach, the Allies' onrush petered out. During the next 2 weeks up to September 17th, they made very little further progress. By the 4th of September, the line looked like this. They had reached the Meuse, had taken some of the smaller ports on the coast, and the British had just captured Antwerp, although the Scheldt wasn't cleared, so the port wasn't yet in use. At this stage, the vast majority of the supplies were still coming from the Normandy beaches, which meant that the road and rail network was struggling. On the 3rd of September, Devers and Wilson visited Eisenhower's headquarters to talk about the logistics situation. Eisenhower was still trying to maintain his broad front strategy, which was now less broad than it had been previously. There wouldn't be an advance in the Ardennes, now lightly defended, and Devers' 6th Army Group would also not advance in the south except to guard Patton's flank. This made sense because the aim was to get to the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany, and this wasn't in Devers' area. At this point, Bradley's 12th Army Group was facing the Ruhr, not Devers' Army Group, so in Eisenhower's view, priority should go to Bradley. In my view, this was correct to a certain extent, but not entirely. The priority should have been solving the logistics issues, which meant capturing the ports and clearing the Scheldt. For this to happen, both Bradley and Devers would need to stop so that supplies could go north. But Eisenhower seems to be trying to maintain his broad front strategy and just allowed his generals to keep going if and when they could, which resulted in the army sitting west of the Rhine until March 1945. Eisenhower was told by Devers that, from late September, Marseille could solve the logistics problems and support 3 more American divisions. Eisenhower was pleased by this, and as the armies advanced, Patton and the French linked up near Dijon on the 11th of September 1944. Devers formally transferred to Eisenhower's control from the Mediterranean theatre, but when Devers came up against the Vosges Mountains, Eisenhower wanted Devers to stay on the western side of them and then move north towards Nancy, forcing Devers to change Patch's plans. Worse, the Germans had somewhat recovered from their previous defeats, and resistance started to stiffen just as the Allies outran their logistics chains. The result was that the advance on all fronts came almost entirely to a halt. On the 14th of September 1944, Eisenhower gave an order to Devers, which would have significant consequences going forward and be vital to answering the original question. The order read: "The mission of 6th Army Group is to destroy the enemy in zone west of Rhine, secure crossings over the Rhine, and breach the Siegfried Line." This is crucial because Eisenhower had given the order for Devers to cross the Rhine. It also displayed a lack of a proper long-term objective. His order doesn't say, reach this particular far-off city, or your overall objective is to advance to Berlin. It's just a sort of short-term objective, and the reason for this was because Eisenhower didn't care for Devers. To Ike, Devers was a bad general, was a problem to deal with, and he didn't want him on his team. He was just cast to the side, merely to secure Patton's flank and nothing more. This is important because nobody at SHAEF, including Eisenhower, had envisioned an advance into Germany from the south. Eisenhower wanted the ports on the coast and the Ruhr. He did not want an advance into Baden, and yet he had just given Devers the order to cross the Rhine. Devers was requesting reinforcements, wanting units transferred from Italy to support his army group, or for Patton's 3rd Army to be transferred to him from Bradley, which Eisenhower declined. In fact, Eisenhower wanted to transfer Patch's 7th Army to Bradley and just do away with Devers entirely, but he couldn't do that due to the French army, which he didn't really want to deal with. Having the French under Devers kept them out of Bradley's and Eisenhower's way. So, while he was telling Montgomery that the front was too big for one ground commander to control, he was telling Bradley that he wished he could give him control of another army, in addition to the 3 that were already in his 12th Army Group. Now, the British and Canadians were using a different supply chain and had fewer divisions to maintain, so they had a bit more capacity to mount their own offensive. Thus, Monty launched Operation Market Garden, in order to drive the tanks to the Issylmere, cutting off the Germans on the coast, and hopefully allowing the speedy clearing of the waters in order to get Antwerp up and running. I instructed Monty that what I did want in the north was Antwerp working, and I also wanted a line covering that port. Of course, Market Garden failed, which not only meant that Monty's narrow front idea was shelved for good, but it also meant that the Canadians had to clear the Scheldt on their own in order for Eisenhower to revive his broad front strategy. This would take time, and as this was happening, Admiral Henry Hewitt did the calculations and informed Eisenhower that Devers' report about Marseille was wrong. There was no way Marseille could bring in that many supplies, and even if it could, there was a transport bottleneck preventing the supplies from reaching the front. In fact, supplies were piling up at the ports right now because the trains weren't running to Lyon. Devers' earlier overstatement reinforced the notion held at Schaeff that he would report widely inaccurate information in order to further his own point of view. Again, his optimism and lack of supporting detail got him into serious trouble. A meeting took place on the 21st and 22nd of September, which saw Eisenhower and Devers in agreement with each other, but only because they both assumed different things. Eisenhower promised Devers extra divisions, which the latter concluded would be used to take the Vosges, take Strasbourg, and get troops across the Rhine in the south. But this was not what Eisenhower had intended. He had only given Devers extra divisions so that he could remain on Patton's flank as Patton went towards the Ruhr. Eisenhower did not want Devers to go southeast to Strasbourg or over the Rhine to Baden. He wanted him to go northeast to protect Patton, and this miscommunication would have important ramifications going forward. Although Eisenhower talked with Bradley nearly every day, he seldom communicated with Devers. And just think about this. You've got 3 Army Group commanders, Monty, Bradley and Devers, and there's obviously problems with dealing with Monty, but you're not really talking to Devers either. People say there was a relationship problem between the Americans and the British thanks to Monty, and there was. But Devers was American, and he was also being left in the lurch just like Monty was. In fact, Devers agreed with Monty. I believe we emphasise too much the capture of terrain. There is no question in my mind, but that the capture of Antwerp and making it a sure port for supply was the essential necessary to permit the army groups of the north and centre to advance. Considerable time has been lost, which may delay the end of this war until next year. So, viewing the situation with Devers, it makes you wonder if the problem wasn't Monty or Devers, but Eisenhower. Eisenhower favoured his friend Bradley over the other two at the expense of the entire campaign. Failing to get Antwerp up and running was a major problem, and by just racing towards Germany with Bradley, the result was that the Allied armies ground to a halt for several months. Perhaps Eisenhower's problem was that he just favoured his friends, so Monty and Devers, the guys on the flanks, were mostly overlooked. I don't know, it's hard for me to conclude this at this moment in time, but if we put aside Monty's egoism, his criticism of Eisenhower is relevant. Since Eisenhower had himself taken personal command of the land battle, the armies had become separated nationally and not geographically. There was a lack of grip, and operational direction and control was lacking. I slightly disagree with Monty here. I don't think it's a national issue. Eisenhower is prioritising his friend Bradley over both Monty and Devers, the latter being an American, so this isn't a national issue because Devers isn't British. Eisenhower had failed to plan any operations beyond Normandy, so he just adopted the broad front advance, and by September, Eisenhower's strategy had resulted in the Allied divisions being spread out thin across a 500 to 600 mile front. This meant that they didn't have the strength to breach the Siegfried Line. So the result was several attritional battles, including the Hurtgen Forest, as the Allied army sat on or around the Siegfried Line until March 1945. Allied forces suffered through the winter of 1944-45 at the end of an inadequate and inefficient supply network. The push across the Rhine was probably more the result of the general collapse of a Germany under attack from the east than of a powerful, overwhelming American and British force. Last time I criticised an American commander, Gavin of the 82nd Airborne, I was chastised for being anti-American and pro-British. But this is nonsense. I've said Churchill is an idiot, and I'm not a fan of Monty either. So I'm neither anti-American nor nationalistic in any sense of the word. I just like to think critically with everyone, regardless of their prestige or nationality. Eisenhower is not perfect, and it appears to me that he made a mistake here. I could be wrong, so if you're American, let me know what you think in the comments. Anyway, Walcheren Island fell into Allied hands on the 9th of November, and it took until the 26th or 28th of November for the first convoy of 20 ships to enter the harbour at Antwerp. And of course, supplies didn't just magically teleport to the front. It took time for the logistics chain to adapt, and it wasn't until the middle of winter when that happened, at which point the capacity of the ports had been reduced as a result of the bad weather. So, during October and November 1944, Patch's 7th Army was shooting more ammunition than they were receiving, and their supply depots ran out of rifle ammunition, and nearly ran out of artillery ammunition too. 300 mules were even drafted to haul supplies to the front. Devers had only advanced about 15 miles between October and early November due to the supply shortages. However, the supply situation began to ease as the railways were repaired, so Eisenhower approved of Devers' plan to strike into the northern Vosges in Operation Dogface. The aim was still to support Patton's army and not to go east through the Vosges to the Rhine, and certainly not to cross the river in that area. If Devers was ever going to cross the Rhine, it would be at Mannheim in the north, not at Strasbourg. But Adams, in his biography of Devers, says that every officer in Devers' 6th Army Group, just like Devers himself, didn't want to just be a minor footnote in the war, and while they understood that their orders were to be the southern flank of Patton's army, they also wanted to do something significant, like get across the Rhine. So, like a genie twisting a wish, Devers and his staff read into Eisenhower's orders and found some technicalities. Exploiting opportunities and seizing a bridgehead across the Rhine were technically consistent with their orders, and so that's what they intended to do. However, Wheeler, in his biography of Devers, paints a different picture. Eisenhower's instructions to his army group commanders weren't clear. He wanted a crossing of the Rhine, and his instructions to Devers clearly state that a crossing of the Rhine was on the cards. But what the orders didn't say was that this crossing would only occur after the West Bank had been cleared of German forces. Eisenhower's instructions didn't say when the crossing should occur, and so it's no wonder Devers didn't know any of this. Perhaps if Ike had spent more time discussing options with Devers, this misunderstanding would not have occurred. But after 6th Army Group joined the crusade in Europe, Eisenhower failed to communicate effectively with Devers. Wheeler explains that Eisenhower was close friends with Bradley and spoke often with him, as well as Montgomery to a certain extent. When he visited the 6th Army Group, however, he spent more time at Hayslip's 15th Army Corps than he did with Devers, since he was friends with Hayslip. Devers was left out of important meetings, and both Devers and Eisenhower avoided each other. Thus, it's no wonder that a misunderstanding occurred. Just to point out, while the historians do disagree with each other over who the main culprit was, there's no contradiction in what they're saying. Yes, Devers may have stretched his orders slightly, but Eisenhower had failed to communicate properly with Devers, so it was a little from column A and a little from column B. They both share in this failure, but Eisenhower takes responsibility since, as Sun Tzu says, if the instructions aren't clear, the fault lies with the guy giving the instructions. So, thinking that they could cross the Rhine if the opportunity presented itself, the planners saw that a crossing was potentially viable north of Strasbourg, and so that's how they planned their upcoming operation. Now, while this was outside of what Eisenhower had wanted, communications were going back and forth between 6th Army Group and SHAEF, and there is evidence that SHAEF were happy with the plan and even wanted it to succeed, so it is a stretch to say that Devers was just going rogue or something. He was operating within the boundaries set by SHAEF, even if he had stretched them somewhat. Well, Operation Dogface began on the 3rd of November 1944, and the French took their objectives in the Belfort area by the 7th, which allowed Patch and Patton to advance in the north. Leclerc's French 2nd Armoured Division took Strasbourg, the capital of Alsace, on the 23rd of November, which came as a shock to SHAEF, who hadn't expected Strasbourg to have been taken. On the 20th of November, Devers requested from SHAEF 2 airborne regiments for an operation to seize territory east of the Rhine, and Devers and Patch were so convinced that they could get across the river that they thought they could do it in the first week of December, although that ended up being a little optimistic. Requests for pontoon battalions and bridging equipment were added to the list, but SHAEF turned Devers down for this and the airborne regiments. It was at this time that Eisenhower and Bradley visited Hayslip's 15th Corps. Eisenhower discovered that Hayslip was preparing for a crossing of the Rhine, and DUKWs were even moving to their assembly areas for this attempt. Eisenhower ordered him to stop the preparations and told them to turn northwards instead to support Patton's forces, which is what Eisenhower had originally wanted anyway. Devers' army group was facing southeast rather than northeast, so it needed to be reorientated. And it was discovered that Brooks' 6th Corps was also preparing to cross the Rhine, so Eisenhower halted its efforts too. 6th Army Group staff were shocked about Eisenhower's reaction. Since daily situation reports and copies of all formal orders had been routinely forwarded to SHAEF, they were surprised that he seemed to know nothing of their preparation. Apparently this was the first Eisenhower had heard about a Rhine crossing. Devers and Eisenhower met up and tried to resolve the dispute. Devers presented the plans his staff had drawn up to Eisenhower and Bradley in a private room. But soon after the meeting began, people on the other side of the door started to hear yelling. Now, we only really have Devers' account of what transpired in this room, and obviously Devers was biased towards himself, so we must bear this in mind. What we do know is that the arguments went back and forth until 2 AM, until both Eisenhower and Devers left angry with each other. Eisenhower told Devers he wouldn't cross the Rhine, and Devers believed this was a major error, so their relationship deteriorated. Devers now openly criticised Eisenhower around his headquarters. Supposedly, Eisenhower argued that Devers was shooting from the hip. The Colmar pocket would be a serious threat to any crossing of the Rhine to their north, especially since Devers had overstretched his army group already. Devers had overestimated the capabilities of the strung-out French 1st Army to hold or deal with the German 19th Army. Eisenhower said that Devers' priority was to clear the Colmar pocket before heading north, let alone cross the Rhine, and their priority remained in the north. The Ruhr was the objective, not Baden. There was no reason to get Allied troops across the Rhine in this area. A defensive line should be made along the Rhine in the south. All spare divisions in Devers' group should assist Patton, and this would allow Bradley to put as much effort against the Ruhr as possible, which was where the bulk of the German army was. Devers supposedly argued that Colmar wasn't really a threat, as only a handful of German Volksgrenadier divisions held it, none of which could mount serious offensive operations. He also argued that Patton's 3rd Army was worn down in the previous fighting, whereas his forces were much better off at this time, so an advance across the Rhine in his area made more tactical sense. But I must interject at this point. Yes, it might be the case that the bunkers protecting the German side of the river were largely unmanned, and it might be the case that a landing in this area might draw off troops from the north, making Patton's and Bradley's task a little easier. In fact, in a letter to his wife on the 24th of November, Patton said that he believed Devers should have sent a corps across the Rhine. However, the problem here was simply that Devers was not looking at the bigger picture. The priority should have been clearing the coast, which was happening, and then the Ruhr. There was zero reason to cross the Rhine in this area. There was talk of them crossing the Rhine, then getting around the rear of the German 1st or 15th armies, perhaps cutting the 1st Army off on the western bank of the Rhine with Patton's help, but in my opinion this was simply nonsense. They didn't have the logistical capability to move forwards, let alone cross the Rhine, then race around the rear of a German army. And there may not have been a real opportunity to cross the Rhine at all. At this moment they were struggling to bring up artillery shells, and the bad weather was hindering air support. The troops were exhausted after weeks of fighting, and it's likely that the Germans wouldn't have been taken by surprise given that they knew where the Americans were on the west bank of the Rhine. The 6th Army Group's own history, written by the men who were in it in May 1945, stated that there wasn't a reasonable chance of seizing a bridgehead at that time. The Germans would have reacted by sending in 3 infantry and 2 panzer divisions, and Schaeff would have had to reinforce the 6th Army Group in order to hold the bridgehead, which was obviously not going to happen. Devers admitted that he was taking a big risk, and General Jenkins also said they didn't have the strength to successfully pull it off. Patch's 7th Army was stretched too thin, as were the French, so crossing the Rhine may have opened them up to a possible German counterattack. It is hard to see how Patch could have both maintained his exposed northern flank and sent a force across the Rhine that was large enough to defend itself against the inevitable German counterattacks. And just because something could be done doesn't mean that it should be done. Crossing the Rhine in this location wasn't a priority and may have hindered the Allied war effort had it been mounted. The French couldn't take the Colmar pocket and wouldn't do so until given the US 21st Corps in January 1945. Sending troops across the Rhine in December may have prevented them destroying the Colmar pocket later. The logistics issues would have prevented them from moving far after getting across the Rhine, and there was nowhere to go anyway. They would have been facing southeast, not northeast where the Ruhr was. So, apart from a gain in prestige, there's zero reason to cross the Rhine in this area, even if it could be done. And once you've crossed the Rhine, it's not like you can just uncross it. Imagine the political fallout that would have occurred if they had retreated back across the Rhine in order to shorten the line during the Battle of the Bulge. There's literally no reason to cross the Rhine at this time. It is true that Patch was stunned by Eisenhower's decision, since his original orders on the 23rd of October included a crossing of the Rhine. Schaeff's directive on the 28th of October also said the Allies would take every opportunity to gain a bridgehead across the Rhine. So Eisenhower was going against his own instructions and definitely takes some of the blame here. Again, if the instructions aren't clear, fault lies with the general who issued them. And Eisenhower was probably frustrated by what had happened previously. The major logistical problems, the grinding to a halt of all the armies, Montgomery launching his own failed operation, the tough slogs at Aachen and Hurtgen, Patton being stalled at Metz, and now Devers, a guy Eisenhower didn't like and was rivals with, was trying to do his own thing. Perhaps Eisenhower just wanted to rein him in. So did Devers' relationship with Eisenhower affect things? Yes. The poor relations resulted in the bad instructions and led to the arguments and resentment. But these poor relations alone don't make up for the fact that crossing the Rhine in Devers' area just doesn't make sense. Historians like to emphasise the feud between the two generals, whilst downplaying the logistical problems and saying it was possible to drive up the east side of the Rhine to encircle the German First Army, at the same time ignoring the Colmar pocket. This is a stretch to say the least. Realistically, Eisenhower takes the blame for the feud, which explains why the miscommunication happened, but Devers is at fault because it should have been obvious that the plan was a big risk that, even if it had succeeded, would have been a road to nowhere. The implication of not allowing Devers to cross the Rhine is harder to predict as it borders on alternative history. That said, Devers and the historians have suggested that a crossing of the Rhine would have pulled German forces away from the north, reducing the number of units for the Ardennes offensive, or just ending the Battle of the Bulge entirely. Yes, or it could have resulted in the Germans moving the units to the south and then launching a major offensive against Devers, throwing him back across the Rhine. Obviously, there's no way to know how history would have played out had this crossing happened, but given the logistical problems, it's doubtful that a crossing of the Rhine by 6th Army Group in December 1944 would have shortened the war. What do you think? Who was at fault here? Should Eisenhower have stopped Devers? Let me know below. And sorry for the delay in answering your question, more Q&As will be answered soon. Thanks for watching, bye for now.